Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Wings Podcast. This is your host, Milind Agnihotri. On today's show, we will meet Anushree Nande, a Mumbai-born writer, editor, and publishing professional who has studied and worked in England, Spain, and the US. Her fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, football writing, literary essays, and articles have been published in various online and print journals and magazines. She has published 3 collections: a microfiction titled 55 Words, a novelette titled Summer Melody, and a travel micro titled Pomegranate Summer. Currently, Anushree is a senior team member at Football Paradise, an award-winning website for long-form articles about football, where she has worked for a decade. And she's also the executive editor blogs at Ladderworks Publishing. Anushree's writings in whatever form tends to explore how we navigate the emotional landscape of our lives and is always hopeful. Welcome, Anushree, to this episode of Wings Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anushree, when I first started interacting with you and we exchanged a few emails and then we had a chat also prior to this recording that we are doing right now. And, amongst the works that you have done, over the years in your writing career, I was caught up with this title called 55 Words, which is a work of microfiction, as you call it. And the voracious reader in me couldn't keep quiet. I ended up, looking up for this title on Amazon. I found a Kindle version. I bought it. I downloaded it. And I thought, let me begin this conversation of ours today by me reading out right now one of the short stories in this microfiction of yours called 55 Words. I hope you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
So what I gather is 55 Words is a collection of 46 stories that you published in 2015 with a publisher called Underground Voices, and
Yes.
Los Angeles-based independent American publisher. And I'm going to pick one of the short stories called Perfect, which is a 46-word short story, which I'm going to read out right now. Here it goes. She always concentrated first on the angles, the edges that defined the structure. The soft curves always drew themselves, just like the light once she filled in the shadows. Discarded, hidden in the sand, she had picked up the shell with its chipped, broken ridges. Art, she believed, was about seeing beauty in the imperfections. End story. Anushree, this sounds quite like a Sanskrit sutra that packs a lot of meaning in few words or syllables. Can you unpack this perfect story for us?
Sure. So the tenet with microfiction, whether it's 55 words or 100 words or 75 words as well, the idea is that you are zoning in on one point in a story that is its all, but it's also part of an ongoing narrative. And that can be very difficult to achieve. So there have been times when I was working on this collection that I spent days on certain stories, just because, it's only when you have a limit for how many words there needs to be that you realize how important each word is. So with Perfect, the idea that sparked my sort of inspiration for it was the fact that as artists, I'm sure every creative professional can relate to this. We have this idea or vision in our heads, and most of us have to be resigned to the fact that once we get it down on paper or in music or whatever the field that we are in, it's never going to be exactly how we envisioned it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Sometimes it can even be a good thing, but it's one of those feelings that you have to get used to when you're a creator. And that it's always something that you can improve upon. There's always something you can redraft. So there are stories of mine from a few years ago. I think even with some of the 55 word stories, I would do some of those things differently now, and or I can see ways in which they can be improved. So it's always it's an ongoing process, and it's never, the work is never really done. So I think so that was the inspiration behind me writing Perfect.
These words that you have written, let me read them out again towards the end
Mm-hmm.
of this 55 word story called Perfect. You've said, discarded, hidden in the sand, she picked up the shell with its chipped, broken ridges. Art, she believed, was about seeing beauty in the imperfections. So, as a creative writer and a creative person yourself, what is the notion that you have when you say you are able to see beauty in imperfections?
So art, as they say, imitates life, and like in life as well, things. I mean, we all strive for perfection. Many of us do, but we, I think, also understand that it's one of those things where the goalposts are always going to be shifting. So there's always more or better. Um, and I think the journey is what I'm concentrating on when I say finding beauty in the imperfections. So just understanding that um, because our art is a representation of who we are as humans, and we're all wonderfully flawed, we're not perfect, um, and yet there is so much beauty in our lives, in the way we are, in how we see the world. And I think that's something that if you don't understand, it can get very frustrating to be a creator, because if you're always chasing that perfection without realizing that it's just a sort of a goal that helps you achieve all the others, if that makes sense.
It does. In fact, let me take this, argument forward by quoting
Mhm.
an article that you wrote on Substack. It's a part of
Mhm.
your interview series, which I'm picking up one that you wrote in February 2023 when you interviewed an author by the name Gloria Chow. I hope I've spelled her name
Mhm.
correctly.
Yeah, you have.
About her book, When You Wish Upon a Lantern. And you interviewed Gloria, and beautiful interview. One of the questions you asked her was, what motivates or draws you to write and tell the stories that you do? And
Mhm.
Gloria gave a fascinating reply. She said, my goal is to write something that entertains myself and is a story I would want to read. I try to come up with fun premises first, and then I take pieces and questions from my life to explore through the characters. I like to delve into morally gray conflicts that don't have an easy answer. And I like to do it with as much humor as I can. I mean, that's Gloria's motivation to write. And I'm wondering,
Mhm.
what is Anushree's motivation, if it is any different than Gloria's?
I would say some of it is similar in terms of her saying that she likes to have humor. Not all of the writing I have done in the past has had humor. I think also because I was uh, exploring my voice and figuring out what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. So a lot of the work you've seen from me in the last couple of years, you will see that humor is playing a more important role. Um, but I think for all the other motivations, it's I like to explore how we as humans react to the world around us, and how we use our emotions and our worldview to go through life. Um, and I think for me, when I start visualizing the stories I want to tell, it's usually is usually either a character that I start with, and I give them certain motivations that I want to explore, and then I put them in certain situations. But there are also a few times when there's a plot that presents itself to me, or there's an idea or a thought that I want to explore, and stories kind of come from that. So I think my main motivation is to explore how we deal with the emotional landscapes of our lives.
So let's look at Anushree Nande as a character in a story called Anushree Nande.
Okay.
And let's look at how she ended up discovering the voice over the years and what have been her motivations since the day probably she picked up the pen or a pencil for the first time to scribble something. Up until, let's say, today, if we were to do a quick, let's say, 2-3 minute short film here.
So contrary to many people who have asked me whether I've always written, I actually didn't write my first proper story until I was in university in England. But I've always been good. I always loved reading. Reading is a habit that was inculcated in me by my father well before I could read. He used to read out to me and my sister, and so a love of the written word was developed, and love of stories. And I think that has always stayed with me. But it wasn't until I was in high school that I realized that I have some talent with words, and I like working with words. So which is when I decided that I want to explore being a writer. And I've been privileged enough to have the means, but also the family support to be able to do that, which started my journey as a writer in England in a 16th century market town in the northwest of England in Lancashire. And that's in 2008. So it's been it's been a long journey since, trying to discover not just my voice, but also, as you said earlier, the kind of stories I want to tell. And a lot of that is still developing. I'm still discovering who I am as a writer. And over the years, it's been a very interesting journey, I would say. Just because I never expected to also find myself writing about football and enjoying writing about football, sort of melding my creative writing side with my love of the game. And all of these things intersecting have made me a stronger storyteller and writer, even though sometimes it can be hard to define my writing, I guess, because there's so many different inspirations and elements. So but it's a journey that I'm still on, and I'm going to be on for the foreseeable future, I guess, for all future, if I'm to put it that way.
You just spoke about your love for the game of football, not just as a writer,
Yes.
but love for the game itself. How did his love affair start? And and how did it end up you becoming a gunner for life?
Well, in 2002, the World Cup was responsible for me discovering the game of football in a true sense. The increased coverage of the game on television for that tournament definitely helped. And then by the end of the tournament, I wanted more, and what I had in those 2 weeks wasn't enough. So I was introduced to the Premier League by a friend of mine, and he is a huge Manchester United fan. So he tried as much as he could to get me to support them. They even won the league that season, but I remember not feeling like I clicked with that team, and I didn't have the words to explain it then. But I remember watching the draw against Arsenal that season and thinking, okay, this is a team that I want to see more of. There was some sort of chemistry, like undefinable chemistry there. And the season after that, uh, we went the entire season unbeaten, became the Invincibles, won the title, um, and I've been a Gunner for life since then.
So let me put out a trivia to you, which I know you already know, but I want to pick your brains on that. Is Arsenal FC, whose fan you are, as you say, a gunner for life, over the last 3 years in the Premier League have moved from rank 8 to 5 to number 1 in the 2022-23 season. So as a gunner, how do you feel about this rise to the top of your football club? And is Wenger magic at play here, despite the magician having left the stage?
Uh, Let me answer this in two sections, so to speak. Um, Today, just being a few hours after we were handed a comprehensive defeat by Man City yesterday,
Correct.
And I do think that it's this entire month has been a very tough month on this young team, and also on us fans. I think if the results of this month had been spread out over the season, they would have been easier to take. I'm not sure how many of us truly believed that we would be at the top spot come the end of the season. Because I mean, Man City they're a finely honed machine. They're experienced. They have an insane amount of depth as well. Um, but I think as a fan, what it's taught me this particular season, uh, because our goal for this season was to get top four, to get back into the Champions League, which we have achieved with 5 games in hand. And I don't think any of us expected us to be in a fight for the title, because we're well ahead of the process of where we need to be. So there's definitely an argument to be made that we have outperformed where we were planning, and we have faltered because we have not been prepared for what we've gone through this season. But I think as a fan, with Mikel Arteta and what he's doing, and it is always tough when a manager who has been there for 22 years leaves, especially with the kind of legacy that he has left at the club. And I think a lot of the values that Mikel Arteta brings to the club, I mean, he obviously has a lot of Pep Guardiola in him. He has a lot of his own self in there. But having captained the club under Wenger, having been there during that time, I do think that he carries a lot of the core values of Arsenal Football Club, which were developed and sort of propagated by Wenger. So there's always going to be Arsene Wenger in the mix. But it's been interesting to see how he has sort of amalgamated all his different influences, and brought us from, like you said, 8th position to now fighting for the title. So I think it's a process where there's still a long way to go, and it's a very exciting team to be a fan of right now, despite the heartache of the last month, I think. But that's part of the journey. Um, so I think overall it's been a good reminder to enjoy what we have instead of, in the moment, instead of worrying about things not in our control, in a way.
And if you were to have an opportunity right now to say something to Arsene Wenger in terms of what he means to you, what would you say to him?
I don't know if you had a chance to read the essay I wrote for him when he announced his retirement from Arsenal. I think the single most thing that I would say to him is thank you. because he's the reason I um, not just cemented my love for football, but he showed me how beautiful the game can be, and that it's not just a sport, it can also be art. So I think the overwhelming feeling is just gratitude.
And, thanks to you, I ended up looking up on Arsene Wenger's life story. And for that, I want to thank you, Anushree. And the legend that he is for the game of football. And, he's been quoted a lot, but there is one which somehow I came across and it has become a part of my quotes library is what he says, and I quote, passing the ball is communicating with another person. It's being in the service of another person. What a perspective, isn't it?
Absolutely. He's largely responsible, like I said, for my cementing my love of the game, but also showing me what the game at its highest is capable of. And he's been this mix of philosopher and visionary and artist. And yeah, like I said, absolutely fascinating, but also very, very grateful.
Undoubtedly. I mean, I was in conversation a couple of days back with a, uh, you know, somebody who's setting up a football club right here in Pune, who's played the game for much of his life, and he's now become a coach. Incidentally, on the Wings podcast, we'll be able to hear his, people would have listened to his episode because it might probably appear before yours. He talked about how this game of football shapes human character, not just for the player, but for the fans as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I never imagined that I would have so much to write about being a fan, and how it relates to the world, how it relates to our lives. And I don't know if you have heard of one writer called Nick Hornby.
Mm-hmm.
He's a British writer. He's a very well publicized Arsenal fan. And he wrote what is probably the most seminal book about the fan experience way back when nobody was writing that kind of thing. It's called Fever Pitch. It is one of the seminal books on football writing because it came out at a time when nobody was writing or publishing that kind of stuff. And writing on football always had to be more formal. It had to be analytical. This was, I think, the first book or one of the first books to talk about what it meant to be a fan and what it meant to follow a team through the ups and downs of the team and your life. And Nick Hornby started going to football when he was a few years old. He was taken by his father. Um, and eventually like that became his anchor in a changing world. So his parents went through a divorce. He was going through ups and downs in his personal and school life and work life, and the one constant for him was his football club. And I think many of us who are fans, who have been fans, go through similar journeys, but nobody before him had written about it in such a way. Like he talks about things like, well, please excuse all of us who love football to the extent where it takes over our lives, because nothing in our day-to-day life has the potential for that kind of delirium, like unexpected delirium, uh, as when one of your players curls in a ball at the end of the game to win the game, for example. So daily life doesn't have the same capacity for unexpected delirium. So please excuse all of us who have so much investment in 11 men or women running around with a ball. So I think that resonated with a lot of people, and obviously now we have a lot more people talking about and writing about what it means to be a fan. But he was one of the first, and he's that Fever Pitch is sort of him keeping a diary across a very important season in the history of the club, which was the 88-89 season. And it was a seminal season because Liverpool were the big team. It has shades of similarity to Arsenal now, because back then we also had a young team, we had a new manager, and we weren't supposed to win. And it all came down to the last day, the last minute of the last day, and we ended up with a fairy tale against Liverpool at Anfield. So 26th of May, 1989. I was personally 3 months, 3 days old, so did not know what was happening. But I always like to say that, it was always sort of fated for me to become an Arsenal fan, because that sort of changed a lot of things for the club. So Fever Pitch ends on that, but it follows his life throughout that season. It follows what the club means to him, but also gives an insight into the psyche of a crazy fan, like a diehard fan. So Fever Pitch was one of the books that got me into also writing about football that way.
So as a diehard fan of the game of football and now a writer for this prestigious online publication called Football Paradise, that's one identity of yours. And then there is this other identity of writer of fiction, non-fiction, poetry, essay.
Yeah.
Have these two identities been in a dialogue or a conversation at any time? For example, the poet and the essayist and the fiction writer telling the football, don't waste your time. That's not for you. This is what is real. And the footballer paradise writer says, hang on, you have no clue what the game of football is. What sort of conversation happens between these two Anushrees?
The conversation is, it's mostly sort of there is a sort of give and take in this communication. So it's less that, don't waste time, you don't know what this is, but it's more of, I've been able to sort of bridge my two worlds in a way that, so because Football Paradise does a lot of long form writing about football, it brings in art and culture and history, because we understand that football is not just what happens on the pitch. There's so much around it. Everyone says, it's sports, don't make it political, but it already is. It's inseparable from all these other elements, and it's also inseparable from the history, the legacy of storytelling. So I think it's actually a very sort of communal experience between these two Anushrees, that I've been able to bring sort of a lyrical sense of writing about football. And being a fan has also helped me find words for emotions that help me in the fiction part of it.
So it's actually not a bout of a boxing match, but rather more a tango.
No. Yes, very much so. Tango is a great way to put it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to, on this note, let me read out a review that one of your readers, who goes by the name Sarthak Dev, has written on Amazon about your novel, your travel micro called Pomegranate Summer. And Sarthak Dev writes, and I quote, lovely set of short stories, each taking you on a unique ride. Anushree's biggest strength is opening up a scene like a movie set and placing you bang in the middle of it. Even after the seemingly short story is over, the characters stay with you. Pomegranate Summer is all about roaming the streets of Granada with her stories. Couldn't recommend it more. So how did this book happen to you? And what did Anushree go through when she was walking the streets of Granada, Spain?
So there's 3 stories in Pomegranate Summer, and 2 of them are actually set in the streets of Barcelona.
Oh, sorry.
And the third one is in Granada.
Okay.
No, and the Granada one is it's titled the title of the collection. It's called Pomegranate Summer because I spent when my visit to Granada happened in the summer, and the fruit of the city is a pomegranate. So hence the title. And the Barcelona pieces are actually written during the time I lived in near Barcelona for 9 months. So I was in a small-ish town called Igualada, which is about 65 kilometers west of Barcelona. And I lived with a host family. I was part of a sort of exchange program for promoting English conversation with kids in schools. So it was during my time here actually that also 55 words was born, because I had to make sure I kept up with my writing in a limited space of time that I had. Because obviously, I mean, all teachers will sort of relate to the fact that you don't have a lot of time when you're working in a school and working with different age levels of kids. So 55 words was born from that, and also all the Barcelona pieces in Pomegranate Summer. The second essay in the collection is actually me tracing the words of Carlos Ruiz Zafón, who wrote The Shadow of the Wind, which is one of my favorite books. And it takes place in a 1940s Barcelona, reeling against the shadow of the Civil War, everything with Franco. And many of these places in the book are still a part of the fabric of Barcelona. So there are walking tours that take you through all of these places. So the second essay is part of my experience of sort of traveling with his words and his characters and doing that pilgrimage in real life. And coming to Granada, that happened a few years after, when I was visiting friends. I came back to the country to visit friends. And they were studying in Granada at that time. So I got a chance to explore the city with them. And there was a sort of, I would say Granada is one of the most unique cities I have traveled to. And I think the mix of the Spanish, the Andalusian culture, and the influence of the Moors, it is a very culturally complex place. And there's a confluence of all these Eastern, Western sort of cultures. So there is something about the very city that's very inspiring. And during the time I was living in Spain for this trip, so this trip, I mostly visited places in the south of Spain. And I was reading a book called How to Travel Without Seeing by one Andres Newman, who I found out later was actually living in Granada as well. So this book, it's journals of him traveling across Latin America for a book tour. So I had all of these inspirations floating around, and I decided to keep my own journal during these travels. And this essay was born out of that.
Yeah, I have some very fond memories of our own visit to Granada. And, as I was listening to you, I actually traveled in my mind to Granada. Asha, I, and Rahul, we were holidaying in Spain. I mean, our idea of holidays is go to one country or one city and spend 8-10 days there. So, there was this time when we said, okay, let's go to Spain, and we spent some 11 days there. And this was a time we were in Sevilla. And then we said, let's go and see the Alhambra. And we just booked a train ticket, and it was an early morning train from Sevilla station to Granada. And we called for a taxi, a cab driver. And he couldn't speak a word of English. Only thing he knew was Spanish.
Yeah.
And we have no clue how to speak or even understand Spanish. But with gestures and all, as Spanish people are, even if they know the other person doesn't understand Spanish, they keep talking with the hope and belief that the other person understands. And we, being Desi Indians, we go by the same, behavior, that we keep talking, hoping that the other person understands. So it was a fun sort of stuff. And the only thing I remember, he asking us, and we were able to communicate well to him, because he asked us, when are you coming back? We said, last train from Granada. We will be back.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good 2.5 hour train ride from Sevilla to Granada. And I think So he said goodbye, have a good time and all. That's about it. And then, we spent the day in Granada, Alhambra, went around those beautiful, beautiful places. The entire train journey of 2.5 hours is like time and space is frozen. All you see is olive trees on
Yeah.
both sides for 200-300 kilometers. There's nothing else. That's what the landscape is. And then we come back to Sevilla, I think close to midnight. And we had no clue how to, reach the hotel from there. And we just come out of the station and I said, okay, let's look for a cab. And we find our cabby driver who dropped us in the morning waiting for us there.
That's incredible.
We didn't call for him. We didn't have his phone number. So we kind of asked him, what is it? And he says, no, you told us. I mean, this is all Spanish-English conversation, okay? But
right,
then I know you said you come back from the last train, and I know it's going to come close to midnight. And I was worried that how will you, your wife, and little son, Rahul was, I think, 10, 12 years old then, find your way to your hotel. So I came to pick you up. And
that is so incredibly touching.
It is. And then on the way, he asked us, would you like to come home at my home for coffee? I said, I couldn't say no. So midnight, we were at his home. And he and his wife were treating us for coffee. He made us look around his house. They were 3-bedroom house, and he had 2 sons, it seems. Both of them were studying somewhere. And then we hugged each other, and then he gave us a small gift, something, whatever it was, memento, souvenir. And around 2 a.m, he dropped us back at the hotel. Wonderful,
That's
wonderful
incredible story,
people, isn't it? I'm sure in Spain you would have met some amazing people like these. So would
I did, yeah.
And then so would your stay.
No, actually, which is the first story in Pomegranate Summer is actually about one such meeting. Okay. So I was wandering the streets of Barcelona. I had some time to kill because I was waiting for a friend, and I still had a little while to go. So I was just wandering around. It was a spring morning, and it was a Sunday morning, so everything was pretty slow, and people were still waking up. And I'm sure you experienced the sort of timeline of people in Spain or in Portugal, even especially on the weekends, like really late nights and very slow mornings.
Yes.
So I was wandering around, and so basically, and I came upon this Sunday market, and this essay is about this stranger, this guy called Rafael. He was this old guy, and he had like a vintage postcard stall. And he spoke English because he also traveled to India in the 70s. And so he was very excited to meet someone from India and also practices English. And it was one of those sort of meetings where you're not expecting anything. You're just walking, and then you run into someone and a stranger. You're never going to meet them again. But it sort of feels like anchoring while at the same time reminding you of the vastness of the universe, I guess. So it's one of those. So the first essay in the book is about that.
Wonderful. In fact, just yesterday, I downloaded the Kindle version of Pomegranate Summer. It's sitting in my inbox. I'm going to read it.
I hope you enjoy it.
Of course I will. I
would love to know what you think, especially because you've been to Spain and Granada.
Yes, I will. We'll talk about that. But then,
absolutely,
we had on our podcast a young painter from Mumbai city, as enterprising like you. Her name is Nilisha Fudd. And beautiful, beautiful episode, which is titled Encountering My Muse. And I asked her, where do you find the subjects of your paintings? And she gave a beautiful answer, Anushree. She said, the subjects of my paintings are all around me all the time. So I kind of said, what do you mean by that, Nilisha? He says, no, I mean, when I look around, I don't see people as people. I don't see moving cars or, traffic sounds, honking as some random events there. For me, all of them are stories. For me, these are like stories floating around. And I imagine in my mind when I'm sitting in a local train in Mumbai, going from Goregaon to Dadar, watching people around, and I see stories everywhere. And that's how they come to me, and then they kind of manifest in the paintings that I do. And I'm asking myself that in this AI infiltrated world that we are already into, where a lot is being made about chat GPT and fear about the wannabe writers just giving a theme to chat GPT and say, write me something which is 150 words, and it'll give it to you. I think, I don't know, the way I look at it is, we writers in flesh and blood are able to see and live stories like Raphael you experienced in Barcelona. And that's how it appeared in Pomegranate Summer. That is something which the AI world will be so far away from. So, what I'm scratching myself, and I cannot stop myself from asking this is, how do you see the power of storytelling in today's modern day tech infested world, where there's premium for attention and there's information overload? Now, how do you
even more than before,
so how do you find your feet in this world and feel confident about it?
I mean, obviously I can speak only to myself and my, like, how I've been navigating it.
Sure.
I think because for like a few years, many years now, there's always been some sort of doom and gloom proclamation when it comes to writing and publishing and print books and bookstores. And incidentally, this Sunday coming up, the 29th and 30th of April, there in the US, at least it's Independent Bookstore Day. And I love the fact that they're still celebrating and sort of encouraging something like that. So there's always been when the Kindle first came out or books first came out, everyone said, oh, print books are going to die. And while there are many people who are of the same belief as me that you can't replace a print book. You can't replace the sort of tactile sensory experience you get from reading a book. What something like a Kindle or any e-reader can do is it has its own different usages. Like I have a Kindle, I read a lot on it, and I find the experience very I don't find the experience inauthentic in any way. It's just a different experience, but it can obviously never replace a physical book. So in technology like that, it is possible for two things to coexist. Because I know e-readers have helped a lot of people with disabilities, people who need larger print, for example, and or so I think a lot of these things have been to just make it easier to access stories for everyone. But I think with something like ChatGPT, for example, we're in more shaky territory, I would say. I still believe that you cannot replicate human authenticity. And the soul, like we all say, what differentiates us from other things in this universe is that the fact that we have a soul, we can think and feel on a higher level. And I don't think we can replace that at all. I mean, sure, like the AI technology will improve and will become better. But it doesn't change the fact that it's being taught on a body of work that has been written by humans. So, apart from the ethical issues with that, because I know a lot of people have still, a lot of publishing houses are making internal laws saying, we won't accept books that are written by AI. And even in the courts so far, they've said, it's plagiarism because it's being trained on, it's very different than humans reading something and then taking inspiration from it to write their own work. But for this, you are training a machine on, you're feeding it with everything that humans have written. So it's not the same. Nor is it, in my opinion, a tool. Photoshop, for example, is a tool because it helps make the process easier. But it's still something the artist has to be able to use. Here it's less similar, I would say, because yes, you are the one giving it the prompts, but it's not helping you to write, it's writing it for you. So so I think personally, I have a strong belief that there's never going to be a replacement to human individuality, human ideas, human authenticity, and that gives me courage, but also it gives me um, even more motivation to continue working on my work and knowing. I mean, stories have always been important. As humans, we've always gravitated towards stories. And they were never insignificant to begin with, but I think now, especially, they're all the more important. So that keeps me going.
This Urdu shair who goes by the name
Yeah.
Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Not that
Mhm.
I understand Urdu poetry, but some of them I'm fascinated of. And Faiz had this very beautiful couplet in Urdu, which is like fairly Hindi in that sense. What you're
Mhm.
telling me about uh, the writers holding their feet and bearing in the tech infested world. Faiz Saab once said that बोल की लफ्ज आजाद है तुम्हारे, बोल के लफ्ज अब भी है तुम्हारे. So I find a lot of hope
Beautiful.
here as a reader and
Yes.
as a very amateur writer myself, that not only as a writer our words are free, but our words belong to us.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
on that note, let me draw your attention to a very interesting series that you've started on Substack called The Story Sunday.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
there is something that you wrote early this year in February, where you said that this series will feature either of my original work or a short story I have really enjoyed. And then you go on writing in that particular post of 26th February 2023. You say that on my birthday
Yeah.
on Thursday, I finally found the inspiration to pick 3 books that I feel best define me. And number
Yeah.
one, you pick The Lord of the Rings. And you
Yes.
also say why.
Huge Tolkien fan. Yeah.
Yes. What you say, Anushree, is why The Lord of the Rings is your all time favorite. You say, for cherishing friendship and fellowship, for finding peace and satisfaction in slow contemplative living, for doing what's right, even when it's the hardest and most complicated, especially so, for doing one's bit in the earth that's ours to till, for the courage of following a different path, for embracing the darkness and melancholy, knowing that it won't last, for life defining hope.
Yeah.
Unquote. So,
Yes.
hope as a theme does run all through your work.
It does. Yes.
Can you put some light on how do you see this simple word called hope in the world that we live today?
Sure.
And why does it matter so
Sure.
much?
So I didn't realize my works were hopeful. Like I haven't initially, when I first started writing, I didn't set out to write hopeful stories. Um, but I think because stories reflect the worldview of the writer, um, the hope snuck in there anyway without me realizing. Um, but once I've realized it, it's not that I've made a particular attempt to make sure it's there, because hope is a part of me. So I think it will sort of show itself in whatever I write, how I see the world, how I live each day. Um, so I think for the going back to the Lord of the Rings, because that's been a like a life-changing seminal book for me personally, because I read it for the first time when I was a teenager, and it was the first time I was so overwhelmed and so sort of enamored by a world, by characters, but also by what the author was writing about. I mean, Tolkien himself, in his own words, went through really melancholic episodes as well. Like, he wasn't always this sort of cheerful, well-meaning professor. Um, but despite all of this, despite all the loss he suffered in his childhood with his parents, all his friends in the war, he still chose to write a story that's ultimately about hope. And I think that's one of the things that always gives me courage. The fact that someone who has been through so much loss and grief and pain still chooses to see the good in the world, without ignoring the bad. And I think that's something that we can all stand to learn from. I'm not saying we're going to be able to do it every single moment of every single day. That's not what hope is. But I think hope is just also having that extra belief that sometimes we can do all that we can, and there are certain things we have to leave up to, like fate or hope. And I think a lot of that comes down to a worldview, essentially. Um, so I'm someone who does feel similarly in terms of, I do go through a sort of existential crisis, and I think that's very familiar. It will be familiar for many creatives as well. Um, but having this sort of understanding that you will always have something to hold on to. I think that's something I want to also give to my readers when I write. Um, but mostly unconsciously. Like I like that it happens that way. I actually have a tattoo in Elvish, which means hope as well. So it's a daily reminder.
You know, I like the way the Desiderata ends with a line which goes, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world.
Yes. Yeah.
Anushree, we started our conversation by me reading out one of your 55-word short stories called Perfect.
Mm.
As we
Yes.
come to the end of this conversation, I would like to read out another of your 55-word short stories. This one goes by the name Constant.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, and I'm quoting your words, Anushree, they are just memories, illusions of their real selves from long ago, her teacher had said. But she didn't care. Through the half-open window next to her bed, the sky was her favorite cobalt blue. She pulled up the duet and started to count with her fingers, knowing that the stars would never run out. Unquote.
Yeah. Absolutely.
On this note, all I can say is, just like for this little girl who is tucked under a duet, confident that her stars would never run out, for Anushree, the writer, all I can say is, let her stories never run out.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Anushree, this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I don't want to put any words around it, but let me ask you, how did it feel for you to be on this show? And overall, what do you feel about what we have tried to do with the Wings podcast? You have listened to a few episodes yourself.
I have. No, I'm honored and touched to be a part of this. And this has been an absolute pleasure. It's not often that I get to have a chat with such breadth. Also in terms of the way the narrative, like you said, the way the narrative the flow of the narrative as well. It's usually that I get called to talk about just my writing or the publishing aspect or the football aspect or the poetry aspect. So this is the first time I've had a chat which has sort of encompassed everything that makes up my world and my work. So it's been a pleasure. And also because it also, like I said, fits into the larger narrative of what you're doing with this podcast. So we all have our individual voices as well, but you're telling a larger story of modern India, and all of us who have chosen different paths and have been able to sort of continue to work in them. So it's a wonderful thing to be a part of.
Anushree, you join 74 other young Indians, young men and women who have come on the show before, each being so gracious to share about themselves, about their lives, about their worlds. And each of these 75 narratives, which have got curated over as many weeks that Asha and I and our son Rahul, three of us who have created this podcast, as our own contribution to celebrate the 75th year of India's independence. And in many ways, I think it has been a very emotional ride for all of us. And we feel ourselves very fortunate to have been able to be given this opportunity to curate these 75. I mean, stories would not be the right word to use it, but a microcosm of what India of 2023 is all about. Young Indians, despite wherever they are, in whichever part of the world they live, fairly anchored in the Indian thought and Indian values, yet having a global outlook, considering the world as their playground. So, as an Indian, I feel we are at a happy place. Doesn't matter what sort of polity we have, what sort of governments we have. I guess that's temporary, but what's permanent is the energy that all of you represent, an energy which is full of courage, conviction, sensitivity, and hope.
Yeah.
As our conversation
all comes back to hope, always.
All comes back to hope. So this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Anushree. Look forward
Likewise.
to chatting up with you once I have read Pomegranate Summer.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. This was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today, my dear listeners. This is your host, Milind Agnihotri, signing off. Goodbye, take care, and stay safe. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered as a piece of any professional advice. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of its guest. Creators of this podcast expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct or indirect, consequential or other damages arising out of any individual's use of this podcast. For feedback and suggestions, please write to wingsindia75@gmail.com. Thank you.